Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Emily O'Gorman and I'm a member of the Blackheath History Forum Organising Committee, and it's my pleasure today to host this talk by Tiffany Shellam. So to start with, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Gundungurra and Dharawal people, and I'd also like to acknowledge that the Blackheath History Forum is located on these lands. So Tiffany Shellam is our speaker today, and she'll be speaking about Indigenous Intermediaries and the Art of Encounter. And her talk today is the Gordon Childe Lecture. So just to introduce Tiffany a little further, Tiffany is Associate Professor in History at Deakin University. She works collaboratively with Noongar people and historians, museum curators, librarians and archivists to critique the archives, unearthing hidden and alternative histories generated by encounters between Indigenous people and explorers and settlers in the 19th century. Her book, Shaking Hands on the Fringe, Negotiating the Aboriginal World at King George's Sound, was published by UWA Publishing in 2009. Her latest book, Meeting the Walo, Aboriginal Encounters in the Archipelago, also published by UWA Publishing in 2019, won the Prime Minister's Literary Award in Australian History in 2020. It's a pleasure to have you with us today, Tiffany. Thank you so much for speaking to the Blackheath History Forum.
Thank you very much, Emily, for that very kind introduction and generous introduction. I just want to share my screen here. Thanks so much, and thank you also to Richard White for the invitation to speak. I feel honoured to be giving the Gordon Childe Lecture, and in doing some reading on his life, I was particularly interested to learn about his work on uncovering the Skara Brae site in Orkney in Scotland, where my ancestors are from, and I've been to Skara Brae a couple of times. I like to think of Childe's work as an archaeologist in the field, something akin to my work in the archive. We've both done careful sifting, patient, close observations to hopefully unearth some past experiences. But perhaps he looks slightly more like a professor than I do. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on whose country I'm speaking from today, and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the Kuringgai, Dharawal and Nyungar people, who are the descendants of the three Indigenous men that I'll be talking about today, Bungaree, Bundle and Migo. So today we are virtually voyaging to this beautiful place, the northwest coast of Western Australia. The islands, archipelagos, the peninsulas and Aboriginal coastal country, which are now referred to as the Pilbara and Kimberley coasts. This northwest coast is spectacular tidal country. Archipelagos are scattered across the fluctuating land and seascapes. The solid red rocks that you see in this photo cover much of this coastal country. This is where my book, Meeting the Walo, is set. The book tells the stories of three Indigenous men who voyaged to this coastline aboard Royal Navy expeditions in the early 19th century. The Australian hydrographic expedition of Phillip Parker King, which began in December 1817, had two Indigenous intermediaries voyaging as part of the expeditionary team. The now iconic Kuringgai cultural broker or go-between, Bungaree, always referred to as Bungaree by King, which is how I will refer to him here. He joined the expedition for the first voyage, and Bundle, a Dharawal man, joined the expedition as Bungaree's replacement in May 1821. Migo, a Whadjuk Nyungar man from the country around Perth, joined HMS Beagle in December 1837 on that famous ship's third voyage. Under the command of John Clements Wickham, they sailed from Swan River, now Perth, to the northwest coast in the wake of King's earlier expedition. I've worked on Royal Navy and exploration archives for many years, and through a collaborative project led by Shino Kanishi and with Maria Nugent, I became fascinated in the search for hidden histories of intermediaries who participated in exploration. This fascination meant labour-intense searching and reading of Royal Navy archives, deep conversations with archivists to understand the ways in which intermediaries were, in some cases, actively hidden in the archive, and working with and listening to the descendants of these intermediaries who are continuing to shape their histories too. On these voyages to the northwest coast, it was in the moments of encounter with Aboriginal people on shore that Bungaree, Bundle and Migo came into full view in the expeditionary archive. And these moments stood out to me because, unlike other colonial encounters, the key interactors or transactors were all Indigenous. I had become trained to see encounters as oppositional between white and black when they were often multi-relational. As Boongaree, Bundle and Migo communicated between the crew and the Aboriginal people on shore, they became central figures in encounters. In Meeting the Whalo, I write about how these men were crucial to the success of encounters, influencing or controlling the stage. But in the archive, their power recedes. Their experiences, so vital on the shore or on the quarterdeck of the ship, had faded or been actively erased. And it has not been a straightforward story of erasure. Sometimes early attempts to include their presence in one archival context did not hold when documents were institutionalised. In making visible these hidden histories, the book also maps those preservation processes and the role of archivists and curators as active agents in both erasure and remembrance. Partly as a result of that process, intermediaries appear unevenly in exploration archives, from occasional rich biographies to little more than shadowy hints. I have learnt that searching for shadows sometimes brings rich rewards. The more I searched these archives, the more I was drawn to the art that was produced as a result of these expeditions. Expeditionary art was produced in a variety of ways, as an informal record, as a method for observation, as outlined by the Royal Navy, or rough, scratchy sketches, watercolours, published woodcuts, and portraits. This art occasionally depicts the intermediaries, sometimes explicitly, at other times obliquely. So I'll first talk about Migo before discussing Bungaree and Bundle. Migo was a Whadjuk Nyungar man whose country, Warrarup, was located along the northern reaches of the Swan River around Perth. Migo was well known as a mediator between the colonists and the Whadjuk people when he joined HMS Beagle in December 1837 for that expedition's voyage to the northwest coast. It was not an easy decision for Migo to join the Beagle, as he was really terrified of the northern men whom he would meet. Like many Nyungar people in this period, Migo held a great fear of his northern neighbours, who were thought to be physically large, violent, and to possess supernatural powers. They were referred to as the Whalo. Migo's shipboard experiences were largely inferred through subtle suggestions. All of these I attended to very closely. A short vocabulary of Migo's Nyungar language is included in the Beagle archive. And to me, the existence of this offered a glimpse into conversations on board. Migo with the officers cross-culturally decoding body parts, animals, plants and stars, while the officers hastily scribbled their best translations in their journals. And while Migo wasn't sketched himself, though he may have been the muse for Stokes's unnamed Aboriginal figure sketched alongside this huge termite mound to offer scale and scene, his Swan River Kylie and spear were sketched here on the right, used as objects of comparison when other Aboriginal weapons were acquired by the crew. These subtle hints are the gentle reminders of Migo's belongings and his presence on board. So while the art of the Beagle voyage only hints at Migo's presence, it is Migo's own artistic practice that I'll focus on here, his song making. And I'd like to acknowledge Clint Bracknell, a Nyungar historian and ethnomusicologist. Well, unsurprisingly, Aboriginal accounts of an expedition are very rare in archival records. John Lort Stokes, the chronicler of the Beagle voyage, recorded Migo's own work of narrating the voyage through song and story. Migo frequently sang songs during the expedition. Being away from family could be difficult for some intermediaries, and on the Beagle's return to Swan River in April 1838, Migo grew increasingly impatient to get home. He would stand by the gangway singing. Stokes suggests that Migo's songs were mournful as he was frequently unsettled at sea, unaccustomed to the movement of the ship. He was homesick too for the stability of his country. Some of the songs were intended for the ears of the northern men, the Walo, of whom he was terrified. These songs may have comforted him and were, I suggest, a means of protecting himself from potential sorcery from the Walo, or his own attempt at summoning injuries through song. While some of Migo's songs may have been sung against the Walo, other songs and stories were a Nyungar form of history-making. The account of the Beagle was ordered and remembered by Migo and relayed in his songs. As the Beagle approached Migo's Nyungar country, Stokes questioned Migo about his return and the stories he would tell his countrymen. His manner of describing his interviews with the wicked northern men were most graphic. His countenance and figure became at once instinct with animation and energy, Stokes wrote. Stokes also recorded that he was quite astonished at the accuracy with which Migo remembered the various places he had visited. He seemed to have carried the ship's track in his memory with the most careful accuracy, he wrote. Migo's description of the ship's sailing and anchoring was most amusing to Stokes. Migo would say to him, "Ship walk, walk, all night, hard walk, then, by and by, anchor tumble down." The ship's constant movement was perhaps disconcerting for Migo, who believed the ship was a living being with its own autonomy. This sense by Migo of the ship as animate was frequently commented on by the crew, who talked of his distress that the ship wasn't getting enough sleep. The Beagle lurched through waves. It responded to the wind, the tides. It groaned, creaked, leaked. Its noises were a musical, lyrical language. Did the ship and its music lend itself to the art of song-making? Songs were a significant part of travel culture in the Nyungar world, constructed and sung by the community to keep travellers safe when in foreign country. Migo's mother sang constantly during his absence on the Beagle, and her song lyrics recorded here by explorer George Gray include "Ship bal winjal Bartadul Gulaneen," translated as "Whither is that lone ship wandering? My young son I shall never see again." This song of Migo's mother that she sang constantly would travel with other Nyungar guides, linking the song of concern about Migo to the travel of others. Travelling story songs and their performative nature made a marked impression on the crew of the Beagle, who witnessed Migo constructing and performing his own songs based on encounters with the Walo and his experience of shipboard life. One officer mentioned that Migo had found a space on the ship to sing. Under the gangway and out of the wind was his auditory ground. The Beagle visited Dupook Island, where they came across Aboriginal petroglyphs etched on the rocks. And Captain Wickham, he drew copies of some of the etchings. One drawing, this one here, he interpreted as a native armed with spear and woomera or throwing stick, who was in the stance of relating his adventures, which is usually done by song and accompanied with great action and flourishing of weapons. This comment by Wickham may relate to his observations of Migo performing his songs and stories of the voyage to his countrymen and women at Swan River at the end of the expedition. When Migo returned home, another Nyungar man composed a song after hearing the stories that Migo relayed about his adventures at sea, particularly his feeling of the pitching and rolling of the ship. Migo's autobiographical songs were taken up and added to by the collective, and as a cycle of songs, they remained in Nyungar repertoire as a continuing chronicle of these events. When I read about these songs, about Migo singing his encounters with the Walo on board, I was quite amazed that the explorers who recorded them gave them so much space in their journals. Today, such messy cross-cultural documents are not often read with complexity by historians who can sometimes be complicit in the erasure of such remarkable accounts. One reason for this is the double blindness they represent, viewed as either inauthentic because of the imperial discourse in which they are framed in the archive, or conversely, heavily coded within a seemingly impenetrable Indigenous knowledge structure. To dismiss such stories as impure, I think, flattens the specific Indigenous experiences of travel that Migo for example, expressed in the moment as explorers negotiated and transcribed his songs in their journals. So I'll come back to Migo and his songs a little bit later and talk now about the archives of Phillip Parker King's expedition and the unexpected ways in which Bungaree and Bundle appear in the archive of art that was produced. Often it is the rough shipboard sketches which are the most revealing of the experiences of intermediaries. Bungaree was a Kuringgai man born in Broken Bay around 1775. Until quite recently, and due to the work of David Hanson, Grace Karskens and John Mundine, Bungaree's stories have tended to focus on his apparent cultural degradation and included very little about his remarkable life as a cultural broker, adventurous seafarer and circumnavigator. Karskens in particular has helped us see the ways in which these kinds of portraits of Bungaree, which might be read as a kind of different kind of history of image making in which Indigenous people were not just the subject, but active in the making of their own images. As Richard White has noted, when explorers emphasise their relationship with their Aboriginal guides, and in this case, Phillip Parker King has sketched a Bungaree twice in the archive, they position themselves as intermediaries between the cultures, as adept at engaging with Indigenous culture and therefore being able to speak for them. Not many Aboriginal intermediaries or guides who worked with explorers had their portraits made, and fewer still made their way into published expedition accounts. This is the case with King's expedition. The published journals do not include any portraits of either Bungaree or Bundle, but they do appear beyond the official accounts. And here, as I said, are two portraits of Bungaree, which appear in two different albums in the Mitchell Library, but neither of these were included in King's published narrative or any of the expeditionary accounts that were made to the public. In the archive today, we get a potted story of Bungaree's experiences on the northwest coast. He loved to spear fish in the shallows. He joined the officers on the beach to collect shells. He was an expert in finding fresh water. He regularly worked with the botanist Alan Cunningham, collecting plant specimens of which he described the Indigenous use and protected Cunningham with a rifle while they botanised on shore. But Bungaree appears most frequently in the archive when he is in the centre of the encounters with Aboriginal strangers. So one encounter that I focus on in the book occurred in Dampier's archipelago in February 1818, where the crew violently brought on board a Yabarara man who was paddling his watercraft between the islands. To appease this man, Bungaree removed his prized English outfit, which he had been given as part of his negotiations to join the expedition, and showed the Yabarara captive his scarified chest. Bungaree didn't leave this man's side while he was on board the ship, and as King records, the man was quite anxious and inquiring after Bungaree when he wasn't next to him. Bungaree attempted to hold a conversation with this man, using his words and his body to communicate. While the man was focused intently on Bungaree, the explorers closely scrutinised the captive, observing his physique in detail, measuring him and sketching him. Bungaree's presence here was also used by the crew in their racial assessments. For them, Bungaree was a mobile yet stable Port Jackson Aboriginal type and was therefore the axis on which all Aboriginal groups were compared and juxtaposed while they travelled. As Bungaree had stripped his clothes, standing side by side with the Yabarara captive, the effect, according to the botanist Alan Cunningham, was a counterpart of mirrored strangers. In this way, Bungaree was also being assessed and scrutinised by the crew. King reflected that the captive was a perfect facsimile of the inhabitants of the eastern coast, again referring to Bungaree. During this on-the-spot comparison on the quarterdeck of the ship, a detailed side profile of the captive was made by King. We might imagine King, sketchbook and pen in hand, working this up quickly as the encounter was unfolding. It may have been an attempt at ethnographic accuracy, an instruction from the Colonial Office prior to disembarking, as he included the scarifications on this man's chest, the digging stick in his hair, and the detailed depiction of his watercraft, which was also brought on board the ship. As a historian, I have tended to put authenticity in the original, tangible archival document that I can see in front of me, believing that digitisation offers a poor version of the real thing. However, it wasn't until the digital image of this sketch was sent to me by the Art Gallery of Western Australia, as I was getting my images ready for publication, that I zoomed in on the sketch and saw a faintly penciled profile of Bungaree alongside the Aberara profile. Subtle visual evidence of King's close scrutiny of these Aboriginal strangers, and a remarkable example of just how hidden the histories of intermediaries can be. I couldn't see this with my naked eye when viewing the sketch at the art gallery, and while only just perceptible here, I think the likeness of Bungaree is clear. King did not give a title to this sketch, but the Art Gallery of Western Australia have titled it Man and Artefact. It is unclear what the artefact in the title refers to. The digging stick in the man's hair, a sign of his established status within the group, or the watercraft which floats on the page above him. In the same album, which features King's portrait of Bungaree, King made an ethnographic montage across 2 pages where he cut and pasted Aboriginal weapons, campsites, coastal scenes, and watercraft from his Australian voyages. It is an abstract montage. The floating log is produced here, and you can see on the top right-hand corner there. And I argue that presented in this way, without the sketch of the Aberara man, the watercraft enters a typology. It becomes an object rather than a utility. Indeed, juxtaposed with Aboriginal weapons from other places, it is out of scale and therefore looks more like a digging stick or a tool of some kind rather than a watercraft. Even though King has identified it in the album as the floating log of the Indians of Dampier's archipelago, an archivist in the Mitchell Library has classified it in the catalogue as an unidentified implement. Bungaree's cultural consultations with the crew on this item, so pertinent in the moment of encounter, evaporate from these archive notes. At a distance from the encounter, as archival documents are transferred from a private archive to a state collecting institution, what might seem the smallest of details, the muddling or recategorising of an artefact by an archivist, can have long-lasting effects. A watercraft, so essential for island life, is represented as a digging stick. For communities today who are searching for their histories to revive dormant cultural practices, these details are vital. The encounter in Dampier's archipelago was played out over several days on shore once the captive had been released from the boat and the Aberara people engaged with the expedition. There is a dawning realisation by the crew in these following days, especially by King, that there is immense value in Bungaree's presence amongst the crew when meeting with Aboriginal strangers. He was looked to and depended on by the Aberara and the crew on board the ship in what was a tense and volatile situation. As more meetings occurred with the Aberara, King wrote, "Bungaree was made very much of by them. He, however, is of great use to us. On the appearance of a black man being with us has given them a confidence what it could be difficult otherwise to instil." This power and importance of Bungaree, which was readily acknowledged by King and his crew in the moment, was downplayed or deleted later in later archival activity. And Bungaree's prominence in the encounters was not as emphasised by King in his published narrative. So I'm now going to talk about Bundle, who replaced Bungaree in 1821 on King's expedition as the intermediary. And Bundle had a long history of sea voyaging by the time he joined King's expedition in 1821. Not long after, and as a direct result of colonisation in 1788, Bundle was orphaned, and as a young boy he sailed under the care of Captain Hill aboard HMS Supply to Norfolk Island for a few months. Then, back in Sydney, Bundle was instrumental in developing the Sydney post-contact pidgin language, and according to First Fleet Officer David Collins, Bundle seemed to have gained some smattering of our language, certain words of which he occasionally blended with his own. This was called the Port Jackson language. A natural cross-cultural communicator, this linguistic dexterity filtered through the Aboriginal world rapidly, benefiting Bungaree, who tried to use this new tongue at meetings at Twofold Bay and in Dampier's archipelago, much to the annoyance of King, who was hoping he would be able to communicate with these Aboriginal strangers in a common language, which of course was impossible. So Bundle's experience as a sailor, labouring on colonial vessels, also made him well placed to join maritime expeditions as an intermediary. And I think his skills as a seaman pleased the crew greatly, who described him as extremely useful. I spent hours and hours poring over King's Royal Navy archive, searching for moments where Bundle might come into view. This vast scattered archive, housed across public institutions, private homes and museums in Australia and the UK, had very little of Bundle's life on board beyond King's published journal. I wondered if that was because Bundle was considered by the crew more in a role of an able seaman because of his sailing experience. And able seamen are always also lost in the background of these archives. So it was a matter really of obsessively reading what was there, looking for action sequences in the episodes and trying to fill in reasons for his archival absence. Interestingly, King recorded Bundle in the pay list of crew at the end of the expedition, writing that Bundle was not upon wages. He did not get paid for his role as an intermediary. However, there's a list here of sums and clothing that was supplied to him throughout the voyage, and that was itemised by King: slops, sundries, and cash. And from this list, we can deduce that Bundle, like Bungaree before him, was an expert negotiator who knew his value to the crew. He was given 3 red caps throughout the expedition, the most common item of exchange by the Royal Navy in encounters with Aboriginal people. And it's quite possible that Bundle used these red caps for exchange when he mediated with foreign Aboriginal groups on the northwest coast. The Yabarara captive had been given one of these caps by the crew, possibly by Bungaree, in the encounter in Dampier's archipelago. Unlike Bungaree, there were no known portraits of Bundle, and I could not find any visual representation of him anywhere until quite late into the research for this book, when I went through the sketches by King that were acquired by the Art Gallery of Western Australia in 1920. I was delighted to find this scene titled "Attacked by Natives, Hanover Bay," which visually narrates an encounter that took place in August 1821 between King's expedition and 2 Warora men. This encounter occurred along the rocky shoreline and dramatic red cliffs of the northwest Kimberley coast. It was a violent encounter in which King's surgeon was speared. Initially, the explorers followed the lead of their intermediary from Bundle, but they tried to take over, and that was when things went quickly wrong. So King has captured this encounter here in his unique style of action sequence sketching, painting a narrative flow of how the encounter unfolded moment to moment. To the right of the scene, 2 Warora men lean back, their spears shipped, ready to throw at the explorers, who are waving their arms irregularly, their bodies out of sync as they attempt to halt the sudden hostility. The sketch captures action and movement. Just left of centre is the only known illustration of Bundle to exist. I'll just zoom in there. You can see that King has written his name in pencil above his figure. When I first saw this sketch, I was struck by how Bundle is so clearly the only person in control in this encounter. While the explorer's arms flail about and they look in all directions, Bundle has one leg back as he leans forward toward the Warora. His body strong, his stance assured, confident in what he is doing. The details of this encounter are recorded in the journals of King and the botanist and in the letters of Midshipman John Septimus Roe. The explorers' ship anchored in Hanover Bay on the 7th of August 1821. A jolly boat rowed towards the rocky shoreline early in the morning, where 2 Wurrora people were standing and calling out to them. Like Bungaree before him, Bundle removed his clothes and stood in the bow of the boat, making signs to the Wurrora as they approached the shore. The 2 men looked down towards the boat from the flat delta above the shoreline and repeated the sign of peace that Bundle had made to them. At first, only King and Bundle climbed up the big red rocks towards the Wurrora, while the surgeon and other officers stayed close to the boat. King wrote that by the time Bundle and King joined the Wurrora on the delta, their spears were shipped, ready to throw. And so he and Bundle offered gifts to the men. In exchange, Bundle received a belt made of possum fur and King received a club. A little later, the surgeon, Dr. Montgomery, and another officer decided to climb up the rocks to join in. Montgomery threw some fish towards the men, and then things began to unravel. As the crew turned their backs on the Wurrora to retreat to the boat, the Wurrora both threw their spears, one hitting a rock and breaking in half, another spearing the surgeon, Montgomery, in the back. Montgomery reacted by firing off a shot from his pistol, while the other officers picked up rocks to throw at their attackers. Bundle picked up the broken spear and ran after the men who had fled. This pen and grey wash sketch is a tableau of friction. It narrates the timeline of this encounter from opening friendly gestures by Bundle through moments of slipperiness and uncertainty by the crew. To the left of the scene, the midshipman, hat in hand, waves for help, while the rescue team, who have been on board the ship looking through their eyeglasses, have rowed ashore and are clambering up the rocks, ready to rescue the party and take their revenge, which they did. I spent a long time studying this sketch in the Art Gallery of Western Australia's collection, thinking about the scene and King's motivation to represent the encounter in this way. I initially believed that King developed this sketch as a memory jogger, as a narrative timeline to help him record the order of events. Then, just a few months ago, more than a year after my book had been published, a descendant of Phillip Parker King showed me another sketch made of this scene by King. Stored in an album owned by one of King's relatives and recently gifted to the Mitchell Library. I now believe this sketch was done first as it has that immediate shipboard roughness to it, and it is dated the 7th of August 1821 in the bottom corner. The title of the sketch is given by King, Treacherous Attack of Natives in Hanover Bay. And I just want to acknowledge Brian Abbott, the descendant of Phillip Parker King, who has shown me this sketch. This is a noisier version of the Art Gallery sketch with even more movement and detail and the addition of an extended timeline to the narrative. Bundle is not in his strong stance of mediation, but rather is bending down, probably to pick up the spear after it had been thrown or to receive something given to him by the Wurrora. This scene is more chaotic. The explorer's body is even less defined. This might feel like an exercise in spot the difference, but attending to King's revisions of this dynamic encounter enables us to understand the ways in which an encounter story takes shape over time. From chaos and action, where we see the surgeon perhaps in the act of being speared and the explorer is in a state of pure panic, to a scene of clarity and control, where in fact Bundle is holding court. I wondered why this neater watercolour hadn't been included as a woodcut in King's published narrative. The weapons that the crew stole in revenge for the spearing had been worked up into a published woodcut. What story would this narrative sketch have told about Bundle if King had published it in his journal? Bundle in control, while the command of the officers visibly slips out of control. In the woodcut of stolen weapons, the explorers are in charge. In my book, I lament the fact that Bundle's name was removed when this watercolour was archived in the art gallery. King, as I said, King had penciled his name directly onto the sketch, which was a common process in his archival practice to document details of events on much of his artwork. Unlike the Mitchell Library, where a catalogue search for Bungaree brings up literally hundreds of items, the name Bundle, however, is absent from the Art Gallery of Western Australian collection notes and database. Therefore, a search for the name Bundle does not show up in the Art Gallery collection. This is how histories of these men remain hidden. I wonder if the Mitchell Library could be persuaded to include Bundle's name in their listing of the album, which includes King's sketch of this Hanover Bay scene, this one here. I'm currently not that hopeful, as the album itself is mislabelled as William Essington King's album, when in fact it was the album of his wife, Christina. Revenge was violent against the Aurora people following the spearing of Montgomery. The crew stole large amounts of their material culture, which they found on the beach in a catamaran, some of which was sent to London. As King recorded in the Bathurst logbook in 1821, 35 spears, 6 stone spearheads, 5 or 6 stone hatchets, baskets, shells, twine, and a knife made from an iron hoop were plundered from the catamaran that they found on shore. John Septimus Rowe, the midshipman, recorded that the stone spearheads were later shared out among the officers, and he sketched the one that he took in a letter to his father. Since my book has been published, Dr. Gay Sculthorpe, curator of Oceania at the British Museum, has amended the British Museum online catalogue to include Bundle's name in relation to Hanover Bay objects collected by the crew that are held by the British Museum. Bundle's biographical details are included in the catalogue too, and his name is searchable. So I'm really hoping that the Art Gallery of Western Australia and the Mitchell Library does something similar to acknowledge Bundle in relation to these collections. This, I think, is how the history of these men become visible and how their biographies might be gradually built upon, episode by episode, catalogue entry by catalogue entry. So I worked with and took advice from many Aboriginal artists, historians and writers as part of the development of this book. And meeting the Whalo took shape after a beautifully serendipitous encounter that I had in 2013 on a dingy street in King's Cross. In 2012, Bundjalung curator and artist John Mundine curated an exhibition for the Mosman Art Gallery in Sydney titled Bungaree, the First Australian. This exhibition was an examination of Bungaree's history by contemporary Indigenous artists. I flew to Sydney to see this remarkable exhibition when it opened, and on a subsequent trip to conduct research in the Mitchell Library on Phillip Parker King's expedition and Bungaree's role in it, I bumped into John Mundine in the street outside my hotel in King's Cross. Mundine is a highly acclaimed curator, artist and writer. He's also easily recognisable. His long dreadlocks nearly reach to the ground. On the plane a few hours earlier, I had been ensconced trying to finish writing a review of Mundine's exhibition on Bungaree. And suddenly, there he was, standing on the footpath across the street. I hastily introduced myself, explaining some family connections that we shared. My sister had worked with his partner, and I told him about the review I was writing of his exhibition. Amazed at such an uncanny encounter, and probably keen to get a peek at my review, John invited me to spend the day with him. We went to an art gallery together, had lunch, and eventually made our way to his office, where we discussed the draft of my review. He suggested a few small changes, corrected some of my grammar, and said how pleased he was with my critique. We discussed the exhibition's process for some hours, talking about different interpretations of Bungaree's character by different artists in the exhibition. We talked about the man, his achievements on board maritime expeditions, and his ways of coping, of living in between. We also laughed together about the unlikely coincidence of our encounter. Mundine was really amazed with our meeting and about the connections that we shared. Did it mean something, he asked, to be writing about King Bungaree, who travelled with Phillip Parker King, and for us to meet in King's Cross? So many kings. It certainly meant something to me. The encounter stayed with me during the research and writing of this book. It reminded me of the significance of Aboriginal people's art and history making today, and the persisting legacy of Bungaree as a man who walked and sometimes danced between worlds. Our encounter at King's Cross mediated my thoughts about the intermediaries and their experiences of navigating the challenges of communicating with the explorers and the Indigenous people in the archipelagos of the northwest coast. Artists Warwick Keane and Leanne Tobin, whose work featured in John Mundine's exhibition, they produced responses to the archival fragments of Bungaree's life as a maritime intermediary, and their artistic mediations on his life influenced my storytelling here. On the left, Warwick's work, The Many Faces of Bungaree, utilises King's sketch, portrait of Bungaree, and Leanne Tobin's work, Clothes Don't Always Maketh the Man, is direct response to the ways in which Bungaree could move between worlds quite easily, or seemingly quite easily, and it wasn't just about his clothes. These important statements by these artists continue to add to the stories of men like Bungaree, stories that remain unfolding. And just to go back to Migo's songs before I finish, other Indigenous artists today are continuing to keep the stories of these intermediaries alive. And there's been some really great recent work done on Migo's songs by Nyungar language experts and musicians. The archived songs have been the focus of workshops with Nyungar elders, and this work, facilitated by Clint Bracknell, Gina Williams and Guy Goose, are regenerating and breathing life back into Migo's songs. So I'll finish now with a clip from these songs that have been produced recently. So we might go to one of these songs now.
Thank you so much, Tiffany, for that amazing talk. And I remember going to that exhibition with you quite a while ago now, I think, at the Mossman Art Gallery.
That's
so
right.
Yeah, it was really nice to remember that exhibition and see some of the artwork that was featured there as well. So to start with, I would like to ask actually about your relationships with the museums and archives that were housing the collections that you were working on. Sorry,
yeah,
that was
Emily.
YouTube interrupting there.
Yeah, I think the relationships that I developed over the kind of 10 years that I spent researching and writing this book, they really shaped the way that I could actually tell the stories in this book. I think I needed to get an understanding of the ways in which this material has been shaped and held by the archives, because as a user of archives, I think we're often not, as historians, we're not often privy to the kind of background happenings of the archive and what kinds of power plays or categorization or positionality has been used to construct the archives and to kind of get them ready for us as users. So the backstories to that, the kind of hinterland of the archive was really important. And so I was really grateful to those relationships and those conversations that I had with the archivists and curators as well, because I also spent quite a lot of time in the British Museum looking at the collections there and how they had been kind of collected by the crew and Indigenous intermediaries involvement. So understanding that backstory was really important, because I think it made me realise the power behind that archival story.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And you, in your book, you quote some archivists who have reflected on the role of power and the archive. And they've obviously done quite a lot of study and reflecting on that. I wondered about the conversations you might have had directly with archivists who are working with your collections. Did you talk to them about sort of your own thinking about archives, and did they have any responses to those or reflections on their practices?
Yes, it was a bit mixed across the years in terms of who wanted to speak about that practice, and as you know, as you can imagine, since these archives have been sort of entered into these institutions, many of the archivists who kind of dealt with them when they arrived in the institution have now retired or moved on. So I couldn't always talk to all of them, but the ones who I did talk to were very generous in their conversations and in giving me the backstory to some of these documents and to the ways in which they've been catalogued and categorised. I was also interested in some of the acquisitions by the Mitchell Library and what that meant in terms of the power of some of these documents. For example, the Mitchell Library acquired John Septimus Rowe's letters, the midshipman's letters, in, I think, probably about 5 years ago, and they paid almost $1 million for them. And I wondered how that kind of value placed on such an archive, which is housed in a safe in the library. You can understand the value and the importance they're putting into this kind of document. But of course, the Indigenous stories haven't been included in that same way and valued in that same way. So I was really interested to find out those kind of discrepancies in terms of the power hierarchy of the archive as well. So those archival stories were really interesting to talk to those archivists, and I think it's a story that archivists have amongst themselves all the time, but it's not that a story that archivists and historians have enough. And I have found that really beneficial.
Yeah, and having that dialogue between the historians and archivists. Yeah, absolutely. So I want to also just remind viewers that if you do have a question, to pop it in the chat for YouTube, and we will answer those, or I'll post those to Tiffany as we go through, and she can answer them. But another question I had, in your book, you reflect on the journeys that you made personally into the northwest of WA and some of the discussions with Aboriginal communities up there about your work and the archives that you're working with. So I wanted to ask you about the time that you spent there, and I suppose how that shaped your thinking, and also what the communities thought about these archives.
Yeah, it's a great question, Emily. I spent probably a couple of months up in the Pilbara over the course of the research for this book at different times. So I went up several times, and just for people who haven't been there before, from Melbourne. It's a very expensive place to go to. These mining towns cost a lot of money to stay in and go. It would have been cheaper for me to go to Spain or to Europe for a week than to go to the Pilbara. So it wasn't possible for me to go and spend huge lengths of time there, but I did travel up there several times, and I found it hard to sort of know how to communicate with the community about these really, really early pre-colonial encounters, of which they didn't have memories of. And I didn't want the communities that I worked with, Injibandi, Nalama, Wangatu people, to feel concerned about that, about not having those stories, those memories. And so we found other things to talk about for a long time first. So we talked about lots of different kinds of histories that they wanted to share with me. And it wasn't until I went up again and again and brought started to bring copies of the archives that I'd unearthed to that community. And then that was when we could sit down and really have these bigger discussions about what was held in the archives and what might have happened, and what their ancestors might have been going through in these moments. And so I think it was the kind of almost like the archive mediated something for us to communicate with, and that was a really powerful moment for me. I feel very grateful to the communities for sharing those stories with me and sharing that experience.
That's a really beautiful way of putting it, that the archives were mediating, and it's almost like the intermediaries were continuing mediating, which is so beautiful.
Absolutely. Yeah, I really felt that way, actually.
So I was also thinking about the role of these intermediaries beyond these specific expeditions, which you focus on in your book, and about their relationships with the explorers and maybe the lead explorers. We all know there was many people involved in these expeditions. Not just the intermediary and the lead explorer, but the whole cast of characters. And I was wondering about these relationships beyond these specific expeditions. So did the intermediaries go on other expeditions, maybe with different lead explorers, but maybe maintaining some relationships with other people in the party? Or were there relationships that continued outside of these specific expeditions, or maybe going on multiple expeditions with the same lead explorer?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. Yeah, I think, but Bungaree certainly had ongoing relationships with with some of the expeditionary members after his sort of his role finished. He was signed up to go again and again, but refused to go, and had a lot of cultural obligations back in Sydney, around Eora country. But yes, his relationship with the crew was fraught, but it obviously continued for some time. He also collected for some of them, so made some natural history specimen collections. So he collected some seahawk eggs, which John Septimus Rowe, one of the midshipmen, donated sort of 40 or 50 years later to the founding of the West Australian Museum collection, and he identified Bungaree as a collector. So they'd obviously kept up a relationship for some time before Bungaree died. And Migo also in Whadjuk country also had relationships with not so many of the Beagle crew, but someone who had been on the Beagle voyage for a short time, who was George Gray, and he was part of that very early moment of the expedition, and then he travelled separately, but he recorded a lot of Migo's songs. And they kept up a relationship back in Perth as well. I don't know about Bundle, about whether he kept up with any of the crew. I didn't sort of follow up on his later sort of biography. I wasn't wanting to write a biography of these men as such, but to kind of get these biographical moments of their time on board the ships. But they certainly were, incredible negotiators and networkers. I think that's very clear from their work on board the ships, and they were very good at conversing and relating to people. Migo became very close to two of the midshipmen on the Beagle voyage, to Benjamin Francis Helpman, who wrote quite a bit about Migo in his journals, and to a few of the other men as well. So, I think they did build up relationships over time. Some of the explorers weren't always thinking positively about these intermediaries all the time. They were constantly assessing them and their skills and their ability, and were not very generous in the way that they assessed them at all times. And so you could see the ways in which their assessment of them changed over time, in their letters and journals and things.
That's really interesting. I guess one of the reasons it's interesting is because of the levels of trust that the intermediaries and the explorers need to have in each other on these expeditions. The intermediaries, are traveling with a whole group of often European men, and they're the only Aboriginal person or non-European person. In many cases, not always. And then at the same time, the European explorers have to have trust that the mediators are acting in their best interests and passing on information. So I guess a question that flows from that is about the information that intermediaries did pass on, and if the European explorers, particularly the lead explorers, were suspicious of any of that information, if they suspected the intermediaries from withholding information from them, and if they were okay with that and understood it as a information they didn't need, or perhaps weren't supposed to have, or if they saw that as withholding key information.
Yeah, they're really good questions, Emily. I think that, it goes down to the kind of crux of the intermediary as a figure being never neutral. They aren't necessarily neutral in these encounters. They can wield power for their own benefits, and these are really quite difficult for a historian today to unpack and know for sure, because of the different scenes that were going on, the different kinds of relationships that we're having, and also the languages that were used. So these maritime expeditions were not moving through country as they were in planetary land-based exploration. So they were dipping in and out of country around the coast, and therefore they didn't have the kind of the other intermediaries who would have been in the country to guide them through other countries in terms of introductions to other language groups. So they were really kind of meeting these groups cold turkey in a way, like they didn't have any prior history to meetings and a shared language or shared cultural experiences. They were really strangers of another kind. And I think this was quite confusing for a lot of the explorers to begin with, not knowing how quickly languages changed along the coast. And they comment on that. They don't understand why Bungaree's Kuringgai language doesn't work at Twofolds Bay, for example. So he relies on his Port Jackson language that he's learnt from Bundle to try and kind of make this kind of boundary crossing that he's using with Europeans to try and enact that on these other strangers who are Twofold Bay. So that's a kind of an interesting slip of language, I think, which is quite telling about Bungaree's uncertainty in what he's doing, but he's finding his way. So I think the explorers aren't so concerned in these encounters about the information that they're receiving in terms of particular in terms of what they're receiving from the intermediaries, because they know that the languages aren't in common. So they're really relying on the intermediaries to give them an entry into to that country that they've just arrived on, to try and find fresh water for them. They were really after the basics of encounter for these intermediaries, not really so much to get lots of detailed information from, which was impossible, they realised anyway.
So it's more a diplomacy, or like a...
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's why they asked the intermediaries to continually take off their English clothes, so that they could be seen to be more Aboriginal to the strangers on shore.
There's sort of a performative diplomacy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Did the intermediaries, that, as far as you can tell, ever try to bring other Aboriginal people with them, as so that there were multiple intermediaries? It seems like they were solo intermediaries, but I was wondering if they tried to bring anyone else with them.
No, I can't remember any examples of those sort of attempts at all. Migo certainly wanted to bring a woman home from the northwest coast with him. He kind of boasted of this the prowess he would have back home if he brought home a woman, a Walo woman. But that never eventuated, and it's sort of hard to know whether that his intentions were recorded accurately in that context. But no, there are no examples that I know of in these maritime expeditions where another intermediary has tried to be coerced to join them. I haven't seen any examples of that. So the kidnappings that occurred were very momentary, and they weren't ever kept on board.
Yeah, okay. I was thinking of, I know with Mitchell, there were 3 intermediaries that travelled with him at the same time, of different ages, and I wondered if something like that, but that was all voluntary. Yeah, it's a
Yeah,
complicated
interesting.
situation, which I won't,
Yeah.
I won't go into
Yes,
here.
that's yeah, and that might have been more possible being land-based. I mean,
Yeah,
these ships were really small. The
yeah.
the Mermaid, the first of King's ships, was really tiny, and even I don't know how they fitted all the stuff in, and they took so much Aboriginal material culture home with them, including lots of watercraft. I don't know where they stored it all, but they wouldn't have had room for any more. And in fact, that's why Bundle, when he joined the expedition, was seen to be so worthy, because not only was he an intermediary, he was also an able seaman, and so he was sort of seen to be 2 men in one, in a way, for the crew. And I think they were really short on space. So
Mhm.
the first expedition did manage to hide a woman who was dressed as a man who'd fallen in love with one of the boatswains, and she was kept hidden on board. So I don't know where she was stored, but
Oh, no.
she was discovered some months in by King. There's very little about her in the archive, literally just about her discovery, and then you don't hear any more about her. So yeah, I
Wow.
wonder which little cupboard she was hiding in, literally. Mm.
Yeah, wow. That's really fascinating. Um, so I did want to ask a bit more about King and the way he recorded some events. So I know, and I've talked to you about his way of, and you've told me about his way of depicting events as a sequence, like a sort of tableau.
Mhm.
And I wondered about that, like, and as you were talking in your presentation just now, his quick sketch to describe a sequence rather than, I was thinking, that's very different to just writing a description, which is another option there. So I wondered about his, like, was this a particular medium for him? And I guess I wondered if you knew anything about his history with artwork or drawing, and why that appealed to him, and and also why he would do a tableau and that sort of sequencing. Was this something that other people were doing? Was this a common thing at the time for explorers to be doing? Or yeah.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I spent a lot of time thinking about this and trying to kind of plot out what he'd been up to. He does this action sequencing kind of narrative sketches in a few of his encounter scenes. So there's one at King George's Sound in 1821 that he also sketches as this kind of story of an unfolding encounter with the Menang people, and also in Luxmore Head, a similar sort of storyline of an encounter. So he doesn't just paint a still scene; it's sort of got this narrative flow to it. I think this sort of style can also be seen in other artists, like William Bradley, for example, one of the early artists in around Port Jackson, who did a series of really incredible art stories, like of the capturing or the abduction of Colby and Benelon, and and Spearing the Governor. He did a whole series of encounter sort of narrative sketches. I think you could call them that. And one of them is on the cover of Inga Clendinen's Dancing with Strangers, that kind of really incredible scene of the soldiers or officers dancing with your people. So I think, yeah, you can. There are similarities in that kind of style of narrative sequence. But I don't know enough about that as a general kind of mode of
Mm.
recording. I know that the Royal Navy was very, very big on drawing, sketching, and painting as a mode of observation. So coastal scenes were really common by other midshipmen and explorers who had been trained as draftsmen, and sketching on board the ship was also a social activity. So it was done together. So often, like that sketch by King of Hanover Bay of the attack of the Aurora people, that might have been also added to by John Septimus Roe, the midshipman. There's lots of different elements by different people that might have been included, and it's very hard to know who was doing what. But I know that it was a group activity on board the ship.
That's fascinating. It'd be great to talk to an art historian about
Yeah,
some of this stuff, wouldn't it?
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. As I'm conscious of the time, and we are going slightly over, as a final question, I did want to ask about your current and future work and what projects you're working on at the moment.
Oh, great. Thank you, Emily. Well, yes, I'm working on what I think to be a very exciting project on a historical fish collection, which is housed in the National Museum of Scotland. And this collection of fish were speared and collected by Menang fishermen from Albany in the early 1840s. And so I'm working with Menang families and curators and archivists in Australia and in Scotland and London on this collection, and we're trying to unpack it. It's currently sort of framed as a Western science natural history collection in a science section of a museum, but actually we're arguing that it's a biocultural collection, and it has a huge amount of Menang knowledge and names and taxonomic processes embedded in the collection. So we're trying to sort of unpack that together. And yeah, it's just beginning now, and it's a really exciting project. Yeah, really great fun.
Yeah, it sounds fascinating and really important. Really important.
Thanks,
so thanks for putting up those details to Kate. And I'll just hold up Tiffany's book, Meeting the Whalo. It's available at Glee Books. So if you don't already have a copy, do buy one. It's an amazing read, a really wonderful discussion of archives and archival collections, as well as just a fantastic engagement with intermediaries, focusing on Migo, Bungaree and Bundle. And it's just a wonderful book. So thank you so much for speaking to us, Tiffany, and for your beautiful presentation. Before you go,
much, Emily.
No problem. Before you all go, I just want to remind you that we do have a final event in our season. So Tiffany's been our final presentation. So thank you, Tiffany. But as a final event, we have a live event in person, which is very exciting. As many of you will know, we did have to move online due to COVID. So we've had all of our presentations online. But we will have a live book launch, which will be for Kath Bishop's book called Too Much Cabbage and Jesus Christ, and that will be at Gardeners Inn at 4 p.m. On November the 13th. So payment for that will be at the door, but you do need to book a place in advance via Eventbrite. So we are currently organising that link, and that will be available shortly. And if you're a subscriber to our newsletter, we will notify you when that is open. Otherwise, please check our website for when that link goes live. It will be very soon. So please join us for that and help us celebrate Kath's book. And have a fantastic rest of your afternoon. Thanks very much.